you to the Davies Memorial Lecture this year. I think we did just mention fire. There are still a few seats. If you have an empty seat, could you just put up your hand so that people can, if there's an empty seat next to you, can you just indicate where they are so that people can?
Volunteer.
There's one there.
Just go next to Jim,
yeah,
please.
there's quite a few yet. So no, okay, fine. There are, I believe, no fire alarms scheduled. So should it go, it is a real alarm, and you need to exit the building. However, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Lord and Lady Davies, the major benefactors of this lecture. I was very sad this week to receive the news of the sudden death of Nigel Coley. Now, I had the very great pleasure of meeting Nigel in November in Old College when the Ukrainian ambassador and others from the embassy came to lay a wreath at the plaque in memory of Gareth Jones. And it was a great pleasure to meet Nigel and to learn more about the life of Gareth. However, very sadly, he was taken ill shortly after that and died of on Sunday just last. So he was only in his late 50s, and he leaves his partner Naomi and his children Rachel and Edmund. And so we have sent our expressions of sympathy to his family. You will know, students, that he left for you, Gareth Jones left for you a travel scholarship that has been set up in his memory. And I believe that that will be added to as a result of the death of Nigel. If we just have a moment's silence in memory of Nigel, and then I will hand over to Jan to introduce the lecture. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winston. Good evening, and welcome to the 2018 annual lecture of the Davies Memorial Institute. My name is Jan Ružička, and I serve as the Institute's director. I'm very pleased to see a very good turnout tonight. Ms. Applebaum was giving a talk and a panel last night at LSE, and I saw that they were boasting a packed room. I think we compare favorably to that, so that's very good to see. The Davies Memorial Institute was established in 1951 to commemorate the work of David Davies of Llandinam. To do that, the Institute strives to promote international peace and cooperation by building upon and furthering the legacy of Lord Davies. Lord Davies must have been a remarkable man, a well-known public figure in his time. He was a member of parliament, writer, soldier in the First World War, and a relentless promoter of peace after it concluded. Like one of the two protagonists of tonight's lecture, he was advisor to Prime Minister Lloyd George. In 1919, together with his sisters, Gwendolyn and Margaret, he endowed the Woodrow Wilson Chair in International Politics. That ensured that our department would become the first of its kind in the world. The endowment was, fittingly, to commemorate the students of the University College of Wales who were killed in the Great War. The David Davies Memorial Institute became part of the department in 2001 when it moved here from London. The Institute hosting many events throughout the year. However, the undisputed highlight of our yearly calendar has always been the annual lecture. The annual lecture series started in 1954. Over the decades, we have welcomed many leading figures in the practice and study of international affairs. Prime Minister Clement Attlee or the US Secretary of State George Shultz, recently Lord William Wallace. Famous diplomats like Harold Nicolson, Abba Eban, or Sir Jeremy Greenstock. Eminent academics, among them Michael Howard, Norman Davies, Robert Jervis. Tonight, joining this list is Anne Applebaum, a world-renowned historian and a columnist for the Washington Post. She's currently also professor of practice at the London School of Economics. In short, Anne Applebaum is a major public figure. She writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, and other prestigious publications. Her book, Gulag, A History, won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize. And most recently, she's published a book called The Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. We could not have asked for a better speaker on tonight's topic. The title of the lecture is A Tale of Two Journalists, Gareth Jones, Walter Duranty, and the Ukrainian Famine. May I please ask you to give a warm aber welcome to Anne Applebaum.
Thank you so much. I really am very delighted to be here. And yes, I am here partly because of Nigel Colley, and so I appreciate your words about him, Madam Vice Chancellor. And I'm partly here because of Gareth Jones, who I know has a connection here and I know has a plaque here in his name. It was really that odd connection between Wales and Ukraine that made me want to take the 5-hour train from London, and I have to take the 5-hour train back at 5 o'clock in the morning. So but I'm nevertheless really pleased to be here for exactly that reason, and really glad that you wanted me to speak on this subject. And I'd like to start, of course, by thanking Professor Ruzicka for inviting me, and for all of you for sparing the time and to listen. Let me begin in the spring of 1932, which is a moment when the warning signs were ample. The peasants of Ukraine, it was very clear to a lot of people, were beginning to starve. And secret police reports and letters from all the districts of the Soviet Union, from the North Caucasus and the Volga region and Siberia, as well as Ukraine, spoke of children swollen with hunger, of families eating grass and corn, and of peasants who were fleeing home in search of food. At that moment, some peasants wrote directly to the Kremlin, asking for an explanation, refusing to believe that the Soviet state was responsible. A quote from one of those letters: "The bourgeoisie has created a genuine famine here, part of the capitalist plan to set the entire peasant class against the Soviet government." But the bourgeoisie had not created the famine. The Soviet Union's disastrous decision to force Soviet peasants to give up their land and join collective farms, the deportation of the kulaks, these were the supposedly wealthier peasants, the chaos that followed, all of these policies which were ultimately the responsibility of Joseph Stalin, who was the general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party at that time. These were what had led the countryside to the brink of starvation. And throughout the spring and summer of 1932, many of Stalin's colleagues sent him urgent messages from all around the USSR describing the crisis. Communist Party leaders in Ukraine were particularly desperate, and several wrote him long letters asking for help. And many of them believed in the summer of 1932 that a greater tragedy could still be avoided. The regime could have asked at that moment for international assistance, as it had during the previous famine in 1921, or it could have halted grain exports. It could have stopped demanding grain from the peasants altogether. Part of the Soviet system it required peasants to give up a certain amount of their harvest, and the state could have just said, "Stop, we won't do that this year." But instead of that, in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo, this was the elite leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, took a series of decisions that widened and deepened the famine, specifically in the Ukrainian countryside. They increased the state's demand for food from Ukraine. They required blacklisted Ukrainian farms and villages to contribute meat and vegetables as well as grain. They refused to halt the export of grain, which continued all through that year. They prohibited Ukrainian peasants from traveling to Russia in search of food. They blocked the roads between the villages and the cities. And then at the height of the crisis, organized teams of policemen and party activists, motivated themselves by hunger and by fear and also by a decade's full worth of hateful and conspiratorial rhetoric, entered peasant households in all across Ukraine and took everything edible. So not just grain, but potatoes, beets, squash, beans, peas, anything in the oven and anything in the cupboard. They took farm animals, they took pets, sometimes they took money and clothes. And the result was a catastrophe, really one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century. Within weeks of Stalin's orders, Ukrainian peasants began eating horses and dogs and cats and rats. And they ate the bark of oak trees, and they ate moss and acorns, and they ate leaves and dandelions. They killed crows and pigeons. One survivor, a girl named Nadia Lutishin, remembered that frogs didn't last long. People caught them all. All the cats were eaten. People ate everything. I imagined the scent of delicious food as we ate weeds and beets. Now, some people survived because they had managed to hold on to a cow or because they had a cousin or a friend in the bureaucracy. Some people slipped around roadblocks and escaped to the cities or to factory towns. Some people survived because the Soviet state, which spotted another opportunity to exploit the famine, suddenly expanded its network of hard currency shops all across Ukraine. So peasants could trade gold and silver for food. People brought their wedding rings, heirloom jewelry, watches, Tsarist era coins, and they took them to the shops and they exchanged them for flour. Although, of course, that also meant that they lost things that connected their families to the past. As they grew hungry, many people went mad. Law-abiding people began stealing food. Previously peaceful neighbors turned on the thieves and lynched them, and famously there were incidents. There was cannibalism, which police reported, although there was no great reaction. Death rates began to spike in the spring of 1933 as Ukrainian peasants began to die in their homes and their yards, leaving their villages spookily empty. They traveled to railways trying to get out. Sometimes they died in the stations. They tried to work in the fields, and they sometimes died in the fields. And they often died in such large numbers that there was nobody to bury them. And all of this tragedy was surrounded by a very deep and profound silence. And neither the Ukrainian famine nor the broader Soviet famine, of which it was a slightly different but still an important part, neither of them were ever officially recognized by the USSR. All of the discussion of the famine was actively repressed by the state. In the subsequent years, actually the statistics of the Soviet Union were altered to hide it. A census that was taken in 1937 was deemed to be too negative. It had expressed, there weren't enough people in Ukraine, not as many as there were meant to be, among other things. That census was repressed, and a falsified one was published a little bit later. The terror that followed the famine, and the fear, of course, that the famine itself created, meant that the silence was complete even inside Ukraine. People didn't want to speak, they didn't want to speak to one another, they didn't want to speak in public, and they kept that silence really up until the 1980s when finally people began to talk about it. Of course, by then they were speaking about their parents and grandparents. And that was something, of course, that was the Soviet state could enforce that silence in this era before television and obviously before the internet. And it could do so using the tactics of terror and using intimidation and using fear. Outside the country, however, the cover-up, and the Soviet state did begin to organize a cover-up, required different and subtler tactics. And these are beautifully illustrated by the parallel stories of two journalists, Walter Duranty and Gareth Jones. But let me give you a little bit of context. In the 1930s, all the members of the Moscow Press Corps led a precarious existence. At that time, they needed the state's permission to live in the USSR, even to work in the USSR, and they couldn't be there if the powers that be decided they didn't want to be there. They also couldn't file or send any stories without official permission. And so without the signature and the official stamp of the press department, the Central Telegraph Office, which is where they sent their stories, wouldn't send their dispatches abroad. And of course, there were no telephones. there was no email. That was how you sent articles. And so to win that permission, journalists would regularly bargain with the foreign ministry censors over which words they could use, which they couldn't use, and they kept on good terms with Konstantin Umansky, who was then the Soviet official responsible for the Foreign Press Corps. One journalist at the time, he was called William Henry Chamberlain, he was the Moscow correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, wrote that the foreign reporter in Moscow works under the sword of Damocles, the threat of expulsion from the country or fear of the refusal of permission to re-enter it, which of course amounts to the same thing. So that was the fear that was applied to the journalists. They might lose their jobs, they might get kicked out, was also enhanced by extra rewards that were available to the journalists who were particularly pro-Soviet or particularly useful to the regime. One of those who was particularly useful and particularly notable at that time was Walter Duranty. And Duranty was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow from 1922 until 1936. This was a role that for a time made him relatively rich, by the standards of the time, and relatively famous. He was actually British by birth, and he had no ideological or party ties to the left, which was unusual. Many of the journalists, of course, in Moscow at that time were either communists or pro-communist, and he had none of those affiliations. And instead he adopted in Moscow the position of a kind of hard-headed and skeptical realist who was trying to listen to both sides of the story. Another quote from him: "It may be objected that the vivisection of living animals is a sad and dreadful thing, and it is true that the lot of kulaks, those are the rich peasants, and others who have opposed the Soviet experiment is not a happy one," he wrote in 1935. "But in both cases, the suffering is inflicted is done with a noble purpose." That was kind of his line on the Soviet Union. And this position made Duranty enormously useful to the regime, which went out of its way to ensure that he lived well in Moscow. And so he had a very large flat, he kept a car and mistress, he had the best access of any correspondent, he twice got coveted interviews with Stalin. This was, of course, something that was very difficult to get. But I've read quite a lot about him, and I've read about him, I've read his own writings, and the more I tried to understand his motivation, it seems to me that actually it wasn't so much the privileges he had in Moscow, and I don't really suspect him of being an agent, although lots of people have tried to find out if he was, or if he was paid. But it seems to me that what really motivated him was the attention that he won from his reporting back in the United States. This seems to have really been his big motivation. His missives from Moscow made him one of the most influential journalists of his time. In 1932, his series of articles on the successes of collectivization and the 5-year plan won him the Pulitzer Prize. And soon afterwards, Franklin Roosevelt, who was then the governor of New York, not yet president, invited Duranty to the governor's mansion in Albany, who was then the presidential candidate, and he sort of peppered him with inquiries and had a dialogue with him, and asked about it afterwards. Roosevelt told another reporter, "I asked him questions all the time. It was fascinating." In other words, this stance of, I'm a neutral, I'm willing to listen to Stalin, I'm a hard-headed observer. This won him both the approval of the regime, which wanted people like that there, who weren't going to say anything negative, but didn't seem like weren't party or communist linked, and it also won him connections and praise in the U.S. Particularly at a time when. Remember, this is the height of the Great Depression in the United States, and people were really fascinated by the Soviet Union and by what they saw as a great experiment, and by people who were hoping to adopt some of the tactics of that experiment at home, really knowing little about it other than what they read that Walter Duranty wrote. As the famine worsened, of course, Duranty, like his colleagues, would have been in no doubt about the regime's desire to repress the story. In 1933, the Foreign Ministry began requiring correspondents to submit a proposed itinerary before any journey into the provinces, and all requests at that time to visit Ukraine were refused. The censors also began to monitor dispatches. So some phrases were allowed, quote unquote, acute food shortage, you could say, or food stringency, or food deficit, or diseases due to malnutrition. This could all be reported, but you couldn't use the word famine. In late 1932, we know that Soviet officials even visited Duranty at home. This may have also served to make him more nervous about this topic. In that atmosphere, of course, very few Moscow correspondents, really none of them, were inclined to write about the famine, although all of them knew about it. Again, Chamberlain, officially there was no famine, he wrote later. But to anyone who lived in Russia in 1933 and who kept his eyes and ears open, the historicity of the famine is simply not in question. And Duranty himself discussed the famine with William Strang, who was a diplomat at the British Embassy in late 1932. Strang reported back to London dryly that the New York Times correspondent had been waking to the truth for some time, although he had not let the great American public into the secret. Duranty also told Strang that he reckoned it's quite possible that as many as 10 million people may have died directly or indirectly from lack of food, though that number never appeared in any of his reporting. I should say that the actual numbers for famine deaths in Ukraine are now thought to be around 4 million, with at least a couple million more in the rest of the Soviet Union. Duranty's reluctance to write about the famine may have been particularly acute in his case because the story would have cast doubt on his previous positive and prize-winning reporting on collectivization and on the agricultural policy. So he had sort of stuck his name to the idea that this was a radical, interesting, successful policy, and the idea that it had this terrible effect was not one he wanted to report. But it's also worth noting that he was not alone. Eugene Lyons, who was a Moscow correspondent for United Press at that time and had been a pretty enthusiastic Marxist, wrote years later that all the foreigners in the city were well aware of what was happening in Ukraine, as well as in Kazakhstan and the Volga region, which were two other areas of famine. And this is a quote from Lyons. He said, "The truth is that we did not seek corroboration for the simple reason that we entertained no doubts on the subject. There are facts too large to require eyewitness corroboration. Inside Russia, the matter was not disputed. The famine was accepted as a matter of course in our casual conversation at the hotels and in our homes. Everyone knew, in other words, but no one mentioned it in their dispatches." Hence the really extraordinary reaction of both the Soviet establishment and the Moscow press corps to the journalistic escapade of Gareth Jones. So Jones, as probably a lot of people in this audience know, was a young Welshman. He was only 27 years old, not that much older than the students in this room, maybe even your age, at the time of his 1933 journey to Ukraine. Possibly he was inspired by his mother, who as a young woman had been governess in the home of John Hughes. This was the Welsh entrepreneur who founded the city of Donetsk, which has become famous for other reasons in recent years, but was originally known as Yusufka, after Mr. Hughes, who founded it. It was a coal mining and processing city, and of course he understood that business, having come here from Wales, and he founded the city. Jones's mother had worked for Hughes as a governess, and maybe inspired by her, he decided to study Russian as well as French and German at Cambridge University. He then landed a job as a private secretary to David Lloyd George. You've already heard that, the former British Prime Minister, and he also began writing about European and Soviet politics as a freelancer. And in early 1932, this is before the travel ban was imposed on Ukraine, he actually journeyed out into the Soviet countryside, sort of weirdly, but haphazardly, accompanied by Jack Heinz II, who's the scion of the Ketchup Empire. He's a friend of his, and the two of them went on a sort of countryside trip in the Soviet Union where he slept on what he remembered as bug-infested floors in rural villages, and they witnessed the chaos of collectivization and, of course, the hints of the beginnings of the famine. He then left the USSR. He came back in the spring of 1933. He came back to Moscow, and this time he had a visa that was given to him largely on the grounds that he'd worked for Lloyd George. It was stamped besplatno, or gratis, so it was a free visa, kind of sign of official Soviet favor. And Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to London, had been very keen to impress Lloyd George and had lobbied on Jones's behalf to get him this special visa. Jones also made a special request, which was to visit Kharkiv, which was at that time the capital of Ukraine. And he produced an invitation from, I'm not sure how he got it, but he had an invitation from the German consul general in Kharkiv, and he said he wanted to visit a tractor factory there. And he was given permission to do that as well, although, as I've said, nobody else was getting permission to go to the Ukraine at that time. When he got to Moscow, he first went around the Soviet capital and he met other foreign correspondents and officials. Lyons remembered him as, quote, an earnest and meticulous little man, the sort who carries a notebook and unashamedly records your words as you talk. Jones met Umansky, who is this kind of foreign ministry official in charge of journalists, showed him this invitation from the German Consul General in Kharkiv and asked if it was Ukraine. Umansky agreed, and so Jones set off for the south. He boarded the train in Moscow on March the 10th, but instead of traveling all the way to Kharkiv, he got off the train about 40 miles north of the city, and carrying what he described later as a backpack filled with many loaves of white bread, with butter, cheese, meat, and chocolate bought with foreign currency, he began to follow the railway track towards Kharkiv. So he got off the train, he started to walk down the track. He obviously didn't know where he was, but he knew that if he stayed on this train track, he would get to the right place. And so for 3 days, with no official minder or escort, he walked through more than 20 villages and collective farms at the height of the famine. The only foreigner, the only outsider that we know of who did that, recording his thoughts in notebooks that were later preserved by his sister and who kept them in the family and who later passed them to Nigel Colley, who spent a lot of his life promoting them and getting them edited and published and paid attention to by historians. Here are a few quotes from the notebooks. He said, Gareth Jones wrote, "I crossed the border from Great Russia into the Ukraine. Everywhere I talked to peasants who walked past. They all had the same story. There is no bread. We haven't had bread for over 2 months. A lot of people are dying. The first village," this is still Jones, "the first village had no more potatoes left in the store of burak, beetroot," he often used, he would stick Russian words into his English notes, "was running out. They all said, the cattle are dying, nichivo kormi, there's nothing to feed them with." Again, he stuck this in. He also, by the way, stuck Welsh words into his notebooks. When you see the facsimile of the notebooks, he would stick, they're just scribbles. I mean, they're not elegant literary productions, but he would put words in, as he was writing. "We used to feed the world, and now we are hungry." This is him quoting Ukrainian peasants. "How can we sow when we have few horses left? How will we be able to work in the fields when we are weak from want of food?" But while he was traveling, Jones slept on the floor of peasant huts. He shared his food with people and he heard their stories. Another quote, "They tried to take away my icons, but I said I'm a peasant, not a dog," someone told him. Another quote, "When we believed in God, we were happy and lived well. When they tried to do away with God, we became hungry." Another man told him that he hadn't eaten meat for a year. Jones saw a woman making homespun cloth for clothing out of threads got from her own sheep, and a village where people were eating horse meat. Eventually, he was confronted by a militiaman, probably a secret policeman, who asked to see his documents. After which, a plainclothes policeman insisted on accompanying him onto the next train to Kharkiv and walking him to the door of the German consulate. This was obviously a sort of nerve-wracking moment. Jones, wrote, "Rejoicing at my freedom, I bade him a polite farewell, an anticlimax, but a welcome one." So he didn't walk all the way to Kharkiv. He got stopped and put on a train, but still he was let go. In Kharkiv, Jones kept making notes. He observed thousands of people queuing in bread lines. Another quote, "They began queuing up 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon to get bread the next morning at 7. It is freezing, many degrees of frost." He spent an evening at the theater. Another quote, "Audience, plenty of lipstick but no bread." And he, of course, spoke to people about the political repression and the mass arrests, which also rolled across Ukraine at the same time as the famine. He did, it seems, call on Umansky's colleague in Kharkiv, who he was supposed to check in with, a sort of foreign ministry minder, but he never managed to speak to him. Very quietly, he returned to Moscow, and then he slipped out of the Soviet Union. A few days later, on March the 30th, he appeared in Berlin at a press conference that was probably arranged by Paul Schäfer, who is a German journalist, a Berlin Tageblatt journalist who'd been expelled from the USSR in 1929. And he gave a press conference which described his journey. And he declared that a major famine was unfolding across the Soviet Union, and he issued a statement. This is, again, a quote from his press conference. "Everywhere was the cry, there is no bread, we are dying." This cry came from every part of Russia, from the Volga, Siberia, and of course Ukraine. Jones's press conference was picked up by two very senior Berlin-based U.S. journalists from the New York Evening Post. Headline there was, "Famine grips Russia, millions dying. The idle are on the rise, says Britain." As well as the Chicago Daily News. The headline was, "Russian famine now as great as starvation of 1921, says Secretary of Lloyd George." Further syndications followed in a wide range of British publications, and Jones himself also wrote a whole series of articles for a very wide group of papers, including some Welsh papers. The articles explained that Jones had taken a long walking tour through Ukraine. Some of the ones about him quoted his press release, and they added details of mass starvation. Jones himself noted that he had broken the rules that held back other journalists. "I tramped through the Black Earth region," that's Ukraine, he wrote, "because that was once the richest farmland in the Soviet Union, and because the correspondents had been forbidden to go there to see for themselves what is happening." Jones, as I said, went on to publish about a dozen further articles in the London Evening Standard and the Daily Express, as well as the Cardiff Western Mail. The authorities, who had showered favors on Jones, were absolutely furious. The Soviet foreign minister himself, Litvinov, complained angrily to Maysky, that was the ambassador in London, using an acidic literary allusion to Gogol's famous play about a fraudulent bureaucrat. So he said, "It is astonishing that Gareth Johnson," if he spelled his name wrong, "has impersonated the role of Chlestakov." This is a famous figure in Russian comedy who pretends to be or is taken to be an inspector general, and everybody genuflects before him, and it turns out he's a fraud. And he succeeded in getting all of you to play the parts of the local governor and various characters from the government inspector. That's this play. In fact, he's just an ordinary citizen. He calls himself Lloyd George's secretary, and apparently at the latter's bidding requests a visa, and you at the diplomatic mission, without checking up at all, insist that the secret police jump into action to satisfy his request. We gave this individual all kinds of support. We helped him in his work. I even agreed to meet him, and he turns out to be an imposter. So they expected a friendly reaction from him, and they got something else. In the immediate wake of Jones's press conference, Litvinov proclaimed an even more stringent ban on journalists traveling outside of Moscow, and later Maysky complained to Lloyd George himself, who actually, this is what the Soviet ambassador wrote. We've seen these files. So Lloyd George distanced himself from Jones and declared that he had not sponsored the trip and had not sent Jones as his representative. What he really believed is unknown. We don't know much about the relationship between Jones and Lloyd George, but it's true that Lloyd George never saw Jones again. The Moscow press corps was even angrier. Of course, its members knew that what Jones had written was true, and what he'd said was true, and a few of them were even beginning to look for ways to tell the same story. Malcolm Muggeridge, who became later a very famous British journalist, was at the time the correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, and he had actually just smuggled 3 articles about the famine out of the country via a diplomatic bag. The Guardian would publish them anonymously, although there were heavy cuts made by editors who disapproved of his critique of the USSR. Remember, the USSR was very popular at that time. And the articles also, unfortunately, appeared just at the moment when the news was dominated by Hitler's rise to power. And so they were largely ignored. But the rest of the press corps, dependent on official goodwill, closed ranks against Jones. And Lyons meticulously described what happened. Here he is. "Throwing down Jones was as unpleasant a chore as fell to any of us in years of juggling facts to please dictatorial regimes. But throw him down we did, unanimously, and in almost identical formulations. Poor Gareth Jones must have been the most surprised human being alive when the facts he so painstakingly garnered from our mouths were snowed under by our denials. There was much bargaining in a spirit of gentlemanly give and take, under the effulgence of Umansky's gilded smile, before a formal denial was worked out. We admitted enough to soothe our consciences, but in roundabout phrases that damn Jones is a liar. The filthy business having been disposed of, someone ordered vodka and zakuski." These are snacks. Whether or not such a meeting ever took place, it does sum up metaphorically what happened next, because on March 31st, a day after Jones had spoken out in Berlin, Duranty himself responded. The headline in the New York Times was, "Russians hungry but not starving." Duranty's article went out of its way to mock Gareth Jones. He wrote, "There appears from a British source a big scare story in the American press about famine in the Soviet Union, with thousands already dead and millions menaced by death and starvation. Its author is Gareth Jones, who is a former secretary to David Lloyd George and who recently spent 3 weeks in the Soviet Union and reached the conclusion that the country was on the verge of a terrific smash, as he told the writer. Mr. Jones is a man of keen and active mind, and he's taken the trouble to learn Russian, which he speaks with considerable fluency. But the writer thought, this is Duranty, Mr. Jones's judgment was somewhat hasty and asked him on what it was based. It appeared that he'd made a 40-mile walk through villages in the neighborhood of Kharkiv and had found conditions sad. I suggested that that was a rather inadequate cross-section of a big country, but nothing could shake his conviction of impending doom. Duranty continued and used an expression that later became notorious. To put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. In other words, what the Soviet Union was doing, there might be some bad side effects, but they're necessary. And he went on to explain that he had made exhaustive inquiries and concluded that conditions are bad, but there is no famine. Indignant, Jones wrote a letter to the editor of the Times, New York Times, patiently listing his sources, huge range of interviewees, including more than 20 consuls and diplomats, and attacking the Moscow press corps. Censorship has turned them into masters of euphemism and understatement. Hence, they give famine the polite name of food shortage, and starving to death is softened down to read as widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. And there, the matter rested. But Duranty outshone Jones. He was much more famous, he was more widely read, he was way more credible. He was also unchallenged. Years later, Lyons and Chamberlain and some of the others expressed regret that they had not fought harder against this line. But at the time, nobody came to Jones's defense, not even Muggeridge, who was one of the few Moscow correspondents who would dare to express similar views. Those of you who know Jones's story, he, having written these articles, he did go back to travel again. He made a second attempt to do foreign correspondence, and he was kidnapped and murdered by Chinese bandits during a reporting trip to Mongolia in 1935. His family always suspected that the Russian secret police had a hand in it, but I haven't seen anything that proves that. Russians hungry but not starving became the accepted wisdom, and it also coincided very nicely with the political and diplomatic considerations of the moment. And so as 1933 turned into 1934 and then 1935, Europeans grew more and more worried about Hitler, understandably. By the end of 1933, the new Roosevelt administration was actively looking for reasons to ignore any bad news about the Soviet Union. The president's team had concluded that developments in Germany and the need to limit the Japanese meant that it was time, finally, for the United States to open full diplomatic relations with Moscow. Roosevelt's interest in central planning, as I said, and what he thought was the USSR's great economic success, again, he was reading Duranty, encouraged him to believe that there might be a lucrative commercial relationship too. Eventually a deal was struck and Litvinov arrived in New York to sign it, accompanied by Duranty. And at a very lavish banquet for the Soviet foreign minister at the Waldorf Astoria, Duranty was introduced to the 1,500 guests and he got a standing ovation. Duranty's name, as the New Yorker later reported, provoked the only really prolonged pandemonium of the evening. Indeed, one quite got the impression that America, in a spasm of discernment, was recognizing both Russia and Walter Duranty. And with that, the cover-up seemed to be complete. And yet, in the past several decades, the fate of these two journalists has been slowly reversed. Duranty's work took a while, I would say, it took several decades as people began to learn the story of the famine, as people began to report it, and eventually as archives became available. His work became controversial. He became really almost a symbol for many people of a journalistic dishonesty. Again, it wasn't just that he couldn't report the famine, or that he wasn't able to do it, as the other journalists were. It was also that when Jones's articles came out, he actively sought to suppress it. In 2003, the Pulitzer Committee debated whether to retrospectively withdraw his prize. They decided against that, but only because, as one member of that committee told me, because they looked back at who else in history had won the Pulitzer Prize, and some of them were so awful that they didn't want to open up that can of worms. But the question about his Pulitzer arises, periodically from time to time. It will probably be considered again. The New York Times has been under pressure for a long time to give it back. Not that a newspaper can give back Pulitzers, because those are given to individual people, but just even to symbolically give it back, although I suspect they would have the same problem that the Pulitzer Committee would when they started looking at who else had won the prize. By contrast, Jones, as you know, in this city, has enjoyed a revival of sorts. He's been the subject of a biography in 2013 by Ray Gunash, a BBC documentary. There have been exhibits about him at Cambridge University. He has a commemorative plaque right here, as I said. Ukrainian diplomats not long ago traveled here to lay wreaths beside it. He's a kind of hero figure in Ukraine. He gets brought up a lot as a as a symbol of somebody who tried to tell the truth. He gets mentioned. I've been many times to Ukraine to talk to people about the famine, and his name comes up. There are books about him, articles about him. There is also, I can't promise you this, but there is meant to be a movie being made about him, and it's being made by Agnieszka Holland, who's a very good Polish film director, backed by Ukrainian community in Canada. I don't know if it'll really get made, but that's the idea. In part, his reputation revived thanks to the efforts of Nigel Colley and other members of Jones's family, who, as I said, found his notebooks, sought to get them published, shopped them around, showed them to academics, got people to write about them, and so on. That was a part of it. Partly, it's because of the Ukrainian government more generally, and because of its broader efforts to revive and to tell the history of the famine. The opening of secret police and Communist Party and Soviet government archives in Kiev and elsewhere in the former USSR has inspired an enormous amount of new research into many aspects of the famine. I published a book about the famine in the autumn, and I was able to use a really wide range of secondary sources. There's now a lot of work that's done on it. And in that context, the Jones story, of course, becomes more interesting, and it makes more sense. I'll also conclude by noting that Ukraine's, the historical politics of Ukraine, and even this academic, the wealth of academic material and research that's done now on the famine, was also maybe less important than the fact of Ukrainian sovereignty. To put it bluntly, the establishment of a Ukrainian state in 1991, I think that was the beginning of the revival of Jones's story, simply because it made Jones seem less marginal, and more central and more important, if nothing else. It's now clear. We now know what Ukraine is. It's a country that has an existence. It has a border. It's got both fortunately and unfortunately a place in the news. And it's now clear that Jones was describing a real place, and you can find it on maps. However inaccurate some of the maps might sometimes be. And now that the existence of Ukraine is more widely understood and accepted, there will be more stories like his and like others connected to the famine, hinting at some of the things that I began with. It's not that often that these shifts in European politics throw up new possibilities for historians or create new areas of interest. But I do think that even if it achieves nothing else, both the reestablishment of Ukraine and also the revolution of Ukraine in 2014, which sought to push the country closer to Europe, have already made readers and writers of history and of that region think twice about what they think they know. Anyway, thank you. I'll stop there.
We have time for questions. So if people would like to, please, here in the third row.
Thank you for making the trip to Aberystwyth. February is not the best season to see the intellectual hub of Wales. I did actually have a look at lunchtime at the background to your book, and on one hand I came across a troll, I think, for the attacking you, I would guess for the Polish government, which was so incompetent as not taken seriously. But more seriously, The Guardian deployed a historian to discuss your book, who sought to put a wedge between the popular historian and the academic community, which the main subtext was to absolve the Politburo of intent that there would be deaths, which seemed to fit a rather larger narrative of fitting with the Russian present government's rewriting its own history. I was just wondering whether this sort of attempt to make a wedge was whether she was typical of historiography in general. And
so this is, I can explain the background to this. So my book does argue that the Ukrainian famine was deliberate. The argument is that there was a general Soviet famine, which was largely caused by collectivization and chaos and all the things that we've always thought caused that famine. But that there was also a kind of famine within the famine, that there was a series of decisions taken in Ukraine in particular that led to a much higher death rate there. And I sort of alluded to some of those at the beginning of the talk when I spoke about there were decisions about cutting there was a kind of cordon drawn around the republic. People weren't allowed to leave. Many villages and towns and collective farms were blacklisted, which meant they couldn't receive any food at all, and there were even any manufactured products. And there was also this policy of activist teams going house to house and confiscating food, which seems to me a fairly, I mean, if you take people's food and then you tell them they can't leave, then you know you're killing them. And the book did make that argument. And although that, I think a few years ago, that was a fairly controversial argument, it's less so now. I'm not the only one who's argued this. In fact, I based my work on the work of lots of other people. Some of you might know the work of Timothy Snyder, who's another historian who writes in this field and who wrote a book making the same argument, although he did it in 6 pages and I did it in 600 or something. So if you want the short version, I mean, his book is about other things too, but he has a little section on the famine, essentially making the argument about intent. There is a large part of the Soviet academic community, not the Soviet academic community, sorry, the Western academic community writing about the Soviet Union, which has never liked that argument. And the woman who you're referring to is a historian who for many years, she softened her tone more recently, but for many years sought to, I want to say it in a really nice way, but she sought to find logic in the Soviet system and some of her work, by the way, is very good. She lived actor. She writes very beautifully about kind of daily life and Stalinism, and she writes good books about the countryside. But she was not interested in the terror. She was interested in daily life in the Soviet Union, and she sought to avoid what she saw as kind of politicized history, which talked about terror and so on. And so she, didn't like my book on those grounds. I have to say, I then wrote a very brief response to her, which I think was the most, passed around. I don't actually use Facebook much, but it was the most passed around Facebook post I ever did, because a lot of what she wrote angered a lot of Ukrainians, and so they immediately stepped in and began arguing about it. But that's the context for that review that you read. And I think actually the Facebook post then pushed that review quite high up on, it's not, I think it's like the first review that you find, so whatever. Actually it's a perfectly all right review. The argument is sort of, the book is all right, but too bad about Anne Applebaum. That's kind of the tone. But there were better ones.
Coming back, it's just quite slides. It does shift towards there was a great transformation, and to make omelettes you have to crack eggs argument. So it does sort of take Stalin off the hook.
So this is, I would say she's a very distinguished academic in her 70s, but yeah, she had for a long time, she was so-called revisionist. She had an attitude towards the Soviet Union that, I don't want to talk about totalitarianism. I want to talk about daily life. They're not really that different from us. The system had some legitimacy behind it. I mean, anyway, she disliked this argument that the Soviet Union was actually trying to kill the Ukrainian peasants. And there are some others who agree with it. So it's still argued about, although I think much less than before, partly because once you marshal the evidence and you, both the oral history and the archival history of that period, it's really hard to conclude anything else. So, Stalin knew that the peasants were dying. He knew there was this crisis in Ukraine. The Ukrainian communists told him there was a crisis in Ukraine. They were begging him, please, send us food, and he didn't. And not only did they not send food, they actually began these collections to take food from people away, and it happened as a result. Most of the argument of the book is actually as a result of a series of decisions about Ukraine. Stalin feared the idea of an independent, sovereign Ukraine, and he sought to repress it because he saw that as a kind of challenge to the Bolshevik, central power in Moscow. And so that was, and the famine was a part of a bigger effort to destroy Ukraine as a nation, which included also this arrest of intellectuals and so on that Gareth Jones heard about in Kharkiv. So it was a very long answer, apologies.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It was a very detailed account of how this debate about this was suppressed by the Soviet state. I'm curious about how you see parallels with similar attempts to control this kind of debate by states made today. For example, by the Polish state with the recent law, but also the Ukrainian state, which from what I understand, there were debates about making it illegal to deny it.
Okay, so I didn't quite hear that. Was that about the new Polish law?
Yes.
There's some.
So what parallels do you see with the attempts made by states today to debate?
To control the discussion of history. Well, I hesitate to compare, almost anything anybody's doing today with Stalin's decision to shut down forever any discussion of famine. That's it was such an extreme act that it's, I don't want to say that anybody, there are no Europeans at present whom I fear to be Stalinists. So, it's not really the same category. But I will say that the urge to control history and to shape history in a way that is useful for the rulers of the present is something you can see in all kinds of societies. Probably the most egregious manipulator of history, at least in Europe right now, China is a whole other issue, is Russia, which. I can even almost remember the moment. There was a moment in the 2000s when after Putin had come to power, when he made a decision to repoliticize history. I worked a lot in Russia in the 1990s. I was actually writing my book about the Gulag then, and I was doing research in archives and meeting lots of people. And at that particular moment in time, nobody was even very interested in history. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who said, well, here you are, this foreigner going around archives asking about the Gulag, doesn't anybody stop you? And I said, no, nobody seems to be very interested in me at all. It was a moment when, the feeling was rather, okay, if this foreign girl wants to go and look at old papers, enjoy yourself, we're gonna be doing something more interesting over here. And I didn't. There was no history policy as such, and actually that was a great moment for writing history in Russia, as I didn't even realize until years later. That I had access to stuff that is now classified again, and there were all kinds of historians then working in the archives. You ran into all kinds of people, Lithuanians writing the history of Lithuania based on archives. There were all kinds of people in the archives and doing really good work that made a big difference. The repoliticization of history and the focus on the positive aspects of Soviet history as they see it, including for Putin the moment of history that he's chosen to focus on and to make, to kind of celebrate in a big way is the anniversary of Stalin's victory over the Germans in the war, because that's a moment of great kind of imperial power and reach, and it reflects how Putin himself wants to be seen as following in that line. So, the Gulag we don't hear about much. They haven't denied it exactly. They're not going back to that. But they just don't talk about it much. And even the history of the war, which if those of you who know it know that the Soviet Union actually lost many millions of people and made some terrible mistakes, including having a pact with Hitler at the beginning of it and probably helping to launch the war. And all that is kind of gone, and now we celebrate, the great patriotic war and the great victory. And so this instinct to control history and to use it as a political tool is, you can see it there. I I think I couldn't quite hear your question, but I think you're referring to there's a recent decision in Poland the Polish government has declared that it will criminalize any discussion of the history of the Second World War, which, I mean, it's actually a very vaguely written law, but it seems to criminalize any discussion of the war which somehow implies that Poland is responsible for the Holocaust or that Poland committed any crimes. And it's sort of it's a particularly clumsy and stupid attempt to shut down conversation. It comes from a kind of national obsession, particularly on the Polish right and far right, that the world doesn't know our story, and the fact that we also suffered in the war isn't really known, and so on. And so it's an attempt to, make people not say bad things about us. And of course, the irony is that it is going to have exactly the opposite effect it already has. It's not I suppose it's not of mass interest, but to those who are interested in Poland who follow it, you will know that there is now a huge online and otherwise journalistic discussion of actually, so what did the Poles do during the war, and isn't it pretty checkered? And it's the history of Poland during the war is unbelievably complicated. It was an occupied country. There was no Polish collaborationist regime. So there's no Polish Vichy. And so the discussion of collaboration is very difficult because it was individuals who collaborated rather than the nation. And of course, there were also individuals who were very heroic, who helped Jews, who formed a home army that fought against the Nazis. And so the very, very complicated, probably the most complicated piece of the war story is the story of what happened in Poland between 1939 and 1945. And this government's desire to kind of shut it down, the conversation, and also to use that as a sort of tool for building support among its, fanatical, minority supporters, it's not only stupid, it will be counterproductive, but it's mostly a domestic political tool. Can we create, pride and, will we, and among our grateful supporters in order to achieve, more political gains. Whether they will, whether that will work or not, I really don't know. I mean, we'll see. But it's a terrible, it's sort of disaster for Poland, kind of reputationally, but also for Polish scholarship and other things. I mean, I wonder whether it will last or whether it's workable. I mean, what they're going to reach out into Aberystwyth, and if you have a conference here where you say something unpleasant about Poland, the Polish secret police are going to come and arrest you. It seems very unlikely. I mean, it's completely unenforceable among other things. But it is part of this. I mentioned Russia, I mentioned Poland, but there are a lot of other examples. It's part of there are many nations which try to manipulate the past for the purposes of the present. And again, I don't really want to say that they're the same as Stalin, but yeah, you can see that urge among leaders in many places. Sorry, that was another long answer. You're asking me hard questions.
Thank you very much for that paper. I very much enjoyed it. I just want to ask a question about the press conference that happened in Berlin, and what were the reactions in Berlin at the time? Because obviously, I'm assuming, not being big fans of communism or the Soviet Union, they would have possibly been used as a bit of a stick.
Yeah, it's actually, that subject is also in my book, what happened, because of course then the Nazis later occupied Ukraine. I don't know what the precise reactions to the Berlin press conference were at the time, but I do know that at a certain point, within a few years later, the Nazis did get interested in using the famine for propaganda. That the Soviet Union is a disaster, and one of the things that's a disaster about it is the famine. And when they occupied Ukraine after 1941, they occupied Kiev and actually all of Ukraine. And one of the complicated pieces of famine historiography is that the first moment when anybody was able to talk about it was during the Nazi occupation. But the way the conversation was, sort of what you were able to say, was very much confined by German propaganda. So it wasn't as if the people who kept memoirs and diaries during the famine, when they couldn't suddenly publish. There was no, so if you think about it, one of the great tragedies of the famine was this inability to talk about it meant that people were unable to express their sorrow or to mourn people or anything. And so, but and then the one moment when it became okay to mention it was not a moment when anybody wanted to read peasant diaries or hear what really happened. And it's, from what we know of the occupation, the Germans spent, a lot of time doing propaganda saying that, of course, the famine was caused by Jews. The sort of long tail aftermath of this, this issue is that so when the Soviet Union began to, so when people began to write about the famine again in the 1980s in the West, one of the lines that the Soviet diplomats would use or Soviet propagandists would use would be to say, the famine is a myth created by the fascists. So this, black and white, you're a fascist if you talk about the famine, or you're a good Soviet citizen if you don't, kind of haunted the discussion of the subject up until the very end. And I think a little sort of whiff of it you got after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. It is just not an accident that the Soviet Union once again said, these are fascists. That anybody who talks about an independent Ukraine or anybody who, is automatically a Nazi. I mean, that's the sort of the language that's been used about Ukrainians that the Soviet Union and now Russia doesn't like for a very long time. So it's a great question, but I think there's even a Goebbels speech where he talks about the famine. It's included in my book. They did try to use it, but it had this odd long-term effect.
Right.
Yes, thank you again. Very fascinating talk. I'm going to ask a slightly esoteric question. I wonder if it just occurs to me, listening to the story, which I knew very little about, so I learned an awful lot today. It's great. That I was thinking about other famines through the 20th century. Mm-hmm. It seems to me there's quite a lot of famines that received very little coverage. I'm thinking of Vietnam in the Second World War, Bengal.
Bengal is a good one. Yeah.
Even in China and in Cambodia, at the times when they were happening, relatively little coverage. So I just wonder if you've, reflected a little bit on the role of famine in the 20th century and the reason why they don't tend to. Of course, there are exceptions, but they don't tend to become big news stories.
In a lot of places, famine is something that happens to poor people, who don't have a huge voice and who aren't. If you look at the Irish famine, people who don't play a big political role and who don't have a role in international politics. And so, particularly if it was a regional famine or one caused by drought in a particular place that didn't have much geopolitical significance, you can see why it would get ignored. I mean, one of the other things I didn't talk about in this lecture, although again it's in my book, the British government knew about the Ukrainian famine. It had its diplomats knew, and as I said, one of them had spoken to Duranty about it, and that's in his report that he sends back to Moscow. They knew about it. The Vatican knew about it. I mean, there were Catholic priests who were still in Ukraine or who were just over the border in Poland and who knew about it. And there were discussions in various places about should we say anything. I mean, should we organize help? And I think the British Foreign Office decided not to do anything because they thought it would anger the Soviet Union, and that was a moment, because of Hitler's rise to power, that was a moment when they didn't want to anger Stalin. They thought we might need Stalin down the line, so this is not the right moment. In the case of the Vatican, the argument was actually similar. This is just not a good moment to be, to be dealing with this problem. So it's not. I mean, the thing that I think is maybe special about the Ukrainian famine is one, the degree to which it was deliberate. I mean, all famines to some extent, this is the famous Amartya Sen description of famine, all famines just in some sense are political because there's always food somewhere. And so if the food hasn't gotten to people, then you need to explain why not. Particularly in the modern world. I mean, we're not talking about the Middle Ages, but in the modern world, if somebody is starving, then there has to be a political and economic explanation for why they don't have any food. And so, but the Ukrainian famine, even given that, is unusual in that, looked in the context of Soviet policy towards Ukraine, it was deliberate, it was designed to kill people, it was carried out by the state against its people. And so the fact that that didn't get any discussion is important, and also because that was a moment when lots of people in the world were looking to the Soviet Union as an example of a country that was succeeding. Look at their great agricultural policy. Maybe we should have collective farms here, was something people were saying in a lot of places. And the cover-up of the famine, of course, distorted what people really knew about the actual result of Stalin's actual policies. So it was, so there was something special about that cover-up. But I think more generally, I think you're right. There are a lot of famines that aren't known, and it's also important, I suppose, to look not to see the world, looking backwards from our perspective in the present. I mean, the fact is that now we know immediately when anything bad happens anywhere, or we can know, because of the internet and because of photographs, and it's true that in the 1920s or 30s, all of that was much more difficult. I mean, the fact that it really was possible to cover up, 4 million people dying in the middle of Europe, because there were so few communications, it was just a completely different kind of world. And diplomacy was different. People concerned themselves less with what was going on inside countries and so on. But it's interesting. There's a very good book that compares the Ukrainian and Irish famines, actually, which are very different but have some similarities. I mean, it's always worth looking at things in comparative to understand them better.
In the back there, please. Yes.
What comes across in this discussion tonight is that the Western world don't realise how poor the Ukrainian people were.
How poor they were.
They were. The Ukrainian people were born of a middle age, of a time when it was of the Middle Age. Their farmsteads weren't what farmsteads are in the Western world. They lived in wooden huts, no lighting, no electricity. Everything they did was by hand. Their tools were hand tools, they had no machinery. The only labour-saving device they had was their horse. So to take their food away from them was forcing starvation upon them and not being able to then feed themselves for many years after that. And the fact that starvation was forced upon them, the Western world needs to recognise that was genocide. And that's what I believe should be recognised. And more countries should realise that it was pure forced starvation and not famine. Famine is the wrong word to use.
No, I agree with that. I mean, the one thing I would say is that Ukraine, which had this famous black earth, which was a very, very rich soil, had been the source of grain for first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union for many years. So that although it was kind of poor by modern standards and compared to modern farming, the Ukrainian peasants were considered, in that context, in the context of the Russian Empire and the USSR, to be rich peasants. I mean, they had a lot of food, they could grow lots of things. Lots of work was done by horse and by hand. But although they were beginning, of course, in the 1920s, there were beginning to be tractors there. But yeah, your basic point is correct. Yes, it was a very poor and underdeveloped society, and it was possible to cut people off, take people's food away, and cut them off from the world.
Albert?
I have a question regarding if your findings, your interpretation of the famine, is there debate in the Ukraine? Is there controversy, or is there like a unanimous vote of saying, well, the Soviets, or is there still resistance from some?
I mean, so in the community of Ukrainian scholars and at Ukrainian universities, no, there's not a lot of controversy anymore. I mean, Ukraine is where most of the work on the famine has been done, and where people are writing PhDs on it and spending lots of time in archives. And I haven't done a survey of the whole country, but it's certainly in the academic community and among people who know and care about this, there's not a lot of controversy. There's a chapter in my book that talks a little bit about historiography. One of the recent Ukrainian presidents did make a great effort to publicize debate and discussion of the famine. He created a lot of famine memorials, and there's a museum of the famine in Kiev, which is quite small, actually. It's not a fantastic museum, but it's a start. And so there's a lot of Ukrainians probably think they know something about the famine without having thought much about it. I mean, it has been part of public conversation there's a sort of annual Remembrance Day now, and the president will make a speech on that day every year. There is something that there is an element of controversy, though, which is a little bit different, which is that the Russian state, which kind of toyed with recognizing the famine, and which kind of recognizes the general Soviet famine, and which at one point in the 90s and 2000s, kind of Russian historians were conceding, well, yeah, there was something different that happened in Ukraine, has now reverted to saying there was no such thing. And there have been, at the political level, the Ukrainian presidents have invited Russian presidents to the famine commemorations, and the Russian presidents have refused. There has been the Russians have kind of shut down, no, this is not, because they see it as part of the national, the recreation of national history in Ukraine, so they have tried to shut it down. So there is that element of controversy, and because of that, we have in eastern Ukraine, where the war between Russian-backed separatists, who are often just Russians from Russia, are fighting the Ukrainians. There was a couple of incidents where famine memorials put up in places like Donetsk. By the way, Donetsk there was a lot of famine in that region in eastern Ukraine. Memorials put up in Donetsk have been defaced or taken down. So somehow the memorials to the famine became somehow symbolic of the Ukrainian state, and the sort of pro-Russians have taken them down. So there have been incidents like that. Ukraine is more unified now. I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn, but it certainly has become more unified in its kind of definition of what is its history and what is its national sense of itself in the last couple of years than I can ever remember, and because of this war, because there's been a kind of unification of the country against the Russians, which is strange because Ukraine and Russia are, it's like, actually I don't want to say it's like England and Wales, because that sounds terrible. No, but I mean, they're very closely related cultures. They share a lot of things. They have a lot in common. They don't hate historically they don't hate each other at all. But this Russian invasion has suddenly made, created much more of a coherent national identity in Ukraine. I mean, just for better or for worse. And I would think around the famine as well.
Simona.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions. The first is about the reception of your book. So can you reflect a little bit on how it's being received in Western Europe versus Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, and whether there have been differences, and whether the argument has been kind of
So the book hasn't come out in that many languages yet. It came out in English, and I actually was amazed, and I say this, it's more of a reflection of the state of the historiography and what people think about Ukraine than it is about me, but the reception was really good, which I was surprised by. But I expected more people to resist, to make the argument that Sheila Fitzpatrick made, which is that, we don't, having some doubt about whether there was intentionality and so on. I thought people might not like it, or they might see it as some kind of Ukrainian propaganda, but really I had great reaction. And I think that partly reflects what I hinted again about at the end of the lecture, which is that people have begun to recognize that, Ukraine is a different place. Ukraine within the Soviet Union might be a slightly different history from Russia inside the Soviet Union, that it's important to start looking at some of these places a little bit different. And so I think the good reception of the book was partly to do with the politics of the moment as much as anything else. Not that it was a politicized reception, but that if it's a real country, then we're interested in its history, whereas before it was sort of kind of mythological and something unimportant. The book comes out in Poland, I think in 2 weeks. I'm going to Warsaw to promote it, and I will tell you afterwards what people say. I don't know what the reaction there will be. It comes out it will be published in Ukrainian. It's being translated now. I have already been to Ukraine to talk about it a little bit because people were really eager to hear about it, and it has had a really good reception there. Of course, I don't know how many people read it in English, but I don't have, it will be out in French and German and Italian and the East European languages at some point, but no, not yet. I don't know if it will be published in Russian. I have had an offer from a Ukrainian publisher to do a Russian language edition, because a lot of Ukrainians read more easily in Russian than in Ukrainian. But whether it will actually appear anywhere in Russia, I don't know. We'll see. My other two books were, my two previous books about Soviet history were translated into Russian, and although they're pretty hard to find, they exist in Russian. The Gulag, I think there's a pirated copy, Russian, you can read online. So fine, yeah.
Please.
Hi, I was interested in the demographic legacy of the famine, especially maybe the situation now in Donetsk and in the east. Was there a greater famine that then lead to a lot of Russian people moving into Ukraine in the 40s and 50s? Or?
So that is one of the more of a long-term effect of the famine was that it reduced the number of Ukrainian speakers in the Ukrainian countryside. There's sort of no question that happened. I mean, there's some controversy, and I describe this in the book, about how fast that happened. It's true that after there were so many peasants died that the Soviet Union had needed people to, in the following year, in 1934, needed people to import people to farm. And in the summer of the harvest of 1933, they actually brought in students into the countryside to bring in the harvest because there was no one to do it. And then in subsequent months, they brought Russians in from other parts, from poorer parts. And remember, this was very rich land, so it was considered an attractive place to live. And they brought people in to live in the peasants' houses and farm the land. And there's an argument among Ukrainian historians whether that was a deliberate Russification, or whether that was just an emergency measure. But there is no question that in the wake of the famine, and also in the wake of this murder of intellectuals and party leaders and the sort of purge in Ukraine of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, that lots and lots of Russians moved into the Republic, over the next couple of decades. And Russians took up major jobs in the government and in, and certainly Russian speakers occupied much more of the countryside than you would have found in years earlier. I've never seen really kind of data on the Donetsk region that I am certain about, but certainly anecdotally, people believe that the countryside around Donetsk was Ukrainian speaking, and of course is now mixed, but more Russian speaking than it was. And so some of the antagonism between Russian and Ukrainian speakers that you've had is also in that sense a result of the famine. So if that was your question. I mean, although I should say, one of the things that foreigners often don't understand about Ukraine, although maybe here in Wales you would understand it, is that Ukraine is a genuinely bilingual country in that everybody speaks both languages, almost everybody. So you can go to a big public meeting in Kiev and people will switch back and forth from Russian to Ukrainian kind of seamlessly. One person, whatever language you like talking most, you can talk. And then everybody understands you and switches back. Which is only annoying for me because I understand Russian pretty fluently and Ukrainian about 75%. So when I'm listening, I miss bits of it. But nevertheless, yes, I think there was a demographic impact on Ukraine of those years was undoubtedly to Russify Ukraine and in the subsequent years.
Wait.
I don't know if it was available for you to study, but I was wondering if the narratives that came from the people who've actually experienced the famine themselves are different from the ones that come, for example, from second or third generation.
That's a good question.
And if that gave you anything interesting.
That's a good question. So I actually made a little rule when I was working on my book, which was not to use the second and third generation memoirs. Partly just because there are so many first generation memoirs of different kinds. There were a lot of oral, believe it or not, there was some oral history that was done in the Soviet Union in the 1980s with people who were still alive. But there was also quite a lot of both oral history and memoir that was put together by Ukrainians who left Ukraine during the war or after the war. And as some of you might know, there was this huge exodus out of Ukraine after the war ended. There were lots of people who, for whatever reason, found themselves outside the Soviet borders when the war was over and they didn't want to go back. And so there was a big Ukrainian diaspora that ended up partly in Western Europe. Lots of them went to Canada and the United States. And they made, and this is described in the book, they made the first they did the first work of, putting together oral history and beginning to collect stuff and create, oral history archives. And I found all of that really useful. So anyway, partly it was just, you can't read everything, and I just made this rule, I'm reading the first generation things. But also I just thought although I have a friend, a Ukrainian historian who's working on second and third generation memoirs to look at how the famine is remembered and talked about, which is quite interesting, and she's doing it in Ukraine, where she's found really incredibly interesting patterns. For example, in Ukrainian villages, people still remember, are you descended from people who were affected by the famine, or are you descended from people who helped carry out the famine? Because of course, it wasn't just, it wasn't Russians, it wasn't people only from Moscow who came to carry out the famine. There were also local collaborators. There were people in the villages who became part of the activist teams and were part of this move to take away food. And you can imagine in those circumstances, people did it for all sorts of reasons, among them being hunger. If you had if you could save your family by taking somebody else's food, you would do it. Anyways, the lines of memory, so people remember that person's grandfather was one of the activists, and and they remember the other. So there are these second and third generation relationships between people who know what their grandparents did, which is really interesting, but it wasn't quite the topic of my book. So I decided that these second, this kind of secondary memory, this is what my grandmother told me, was important, but it wasn't. It was a different story from what I was trying to write about what actually happened. So what happened between 1931 and 1933? What can we really know about it? And although the question of how the next generation and the one after that then discussed it is important, it wasn't it wasn't what I was doing. Anyway, that's another long answer. It's a good question.
Last question. We'll take one, if there is one.
Can I ask one more?
Ken, sorry. Joe student.
Is there a Jones Duranty story in Putin's Moscow?
Okay. So, yeah, I'm sure there is. There is I've just forgotten his name. There is a British journalist who works for RT, which is the Russian television, who I know has done quite a lot of reporting from Eastern Ukraine, kind of from the other point of view, denying there's a Russian invasion and so on. So you can certainly find journalists, Western journalists, British journalists who report from the point of view of dictatorships now. I mean, and I think probably if you went back through time, you'd find a lot more of them. I mean, it's a little bit different. The Durante and Jones story is specific because, of course, the kind of control that Duranty had and the kind of influence that he had over the news is something that really nobody has anymore. There's now so much more news and so many more sources of information. It's hard to imagine that one journalist could kind of shut down the conversation that way. So I don't think there's an exact parallel, but are there journalists who seek to tell the truth despite obstacles put in their way by dictatorships, and are there journalists who collaborate with dictatorships, for whatever reason, because it's useful, because it makes them important, because it gives them access? Yeah, I mean, I think they're both. I don't know how many, if you ever get such a clear example as the Durante and Jones story, but yeah, of course there are many now.
Great, thank you. A few words of thanks. Before thanking Applebaum for her excellent talk and no less excellent Q&A, which was taking us on excursion to way further afield than just the famine in Ukraine and the Jones and Durante story, I would like to thank two others who have made tonight's lecture possible. Much organizational support has been provided by a great group of the DDMI interns who you might have seen around the room taking pictures, tweeting, and pouring you wine glasses and all sorts of good things. Thanks to them, we will have a vidcast of the lecture available on our Facebook shortly. And you can follow what was said on the Twitter feed of the Institute. I would also like to thank the head of department, Richard Beardsworth, who's not here, unfortunately, tonight because of his other obligations, but whose continuous support to the Institute remains crucial. I should also like to thank Ken Booth, who in his role of honorary president of the DDMI has been equally important over the years, and certainly during my tenure over the last 5 years. Special thanks are in order to Lord and Lady Davies for their attendance at tonight's lecture. They remain exceptional supporters of the Institute. Their presence and continued support underlines the remarkable involvement of the Davies family with the DDMI, the department, and the university as a whole. Thank you very much. I also want to take this public opportunity to thank Lord Davies and other trustees of the Gwendolyn and Margaret Davies Charity for their continued support, which is vital to the Institute and to the annual lecture series. David Davies wrote many books, and he was a prolific writer. Curiously enough, even though he was writing in the late 1920s, throughout 1930s, and in early 1940s, there is very little to be found about the Soviet Union and Russia. I looked carefully because I like to go and say something from his perspective about the topic of the lecture, and in the years past I've always managed. And I was a little bit at a loss this time around until I found a chapter in his book from 1942. Then the book's called Facing the Future, Letters to John Citizen, and there is a chapter on socialism. And he did not approve for all sorts of reasons. And he gives a specific example to John the Citizen, and he starts that part, let me give you an example of what I'm driving at. I have known farm laborers, and then he goes and says what happens to farm laborers under socialism, or what he thinks happens to them. And then he concludes, I believe in freeholders. They are the backbone of any democratic country because they are free and independent and need not go cap in hand to anyone. Now that's not quite about Ukraine directly, but I'm sure you've all understood in the context of tonight's lecture what happens when free people like this are destroyed. I would like to thank Anna Applebaum once again for her outstanding talk, and please join me in showing our appreciation once more.